Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is Ahmed Al-Wasmi welcoming you to the special program to talk about the latest developments in Sharm el-Sheikh Summit COP27. World leaders gathered to tackle global warming at the UN Climate Summit in Egypt for the countries most affected by the climate change. COP27 is the 27th annual UN meeting on the climate action. It will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh from the 6th until the 18th of this month. It always follows a year of the climate-related disaster and broken temperature record. UN climate summits are held every year for the governments to agree steps to limit global temperature rising. During the special program, we will be honored to host our guest, Dr. Ameera Al-Hassan, UNHGCC Regional Office Head Mission, to talk about the latest developments in the COP27 summit.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ameera Al-Hassan, head of the UN Habitat GCC Kuwait office, and to start this question with this distinguished guest. We've known each other for a long time ago. We met each other a long time ago. It's always a pleasure to have you here in our program. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure meeting you.
Pleasure is always ours. The United Nations Human Settlement Program Habitat launched several campaigns addressing the climate action like Kuwait plans earlier this October. I just wanted to mention this to our dear viewers. But now, could you tell us more about these initiatives and the outcomes on the climate action in the region?
Well, about this campaign, it started in 2019. In fact, Ministry of Information in Kuwait was one of our partners. When we initiated the Kuwait Plants campaign, people were curious about it because we were celebrating Urban October. For the UN Habitat, October is our month. So every year we started with the first Monday of October, celebrating World Habitat Day, and we ended with the World Cities Day on 31st of October. For us, raising awareness on planting trees is something very important because trees can help us combat the effect of climate change. Mitigating the effect of climate change in Kuwait is very important, as Kuwait saw a very arid climate in the last 4 decades. Low precipitation rates. We witnessed a rise in the events of sand dust storms in the last few decades, rise in public health problems, especially those that are related to respiratory system because of the high contamination and pollution rate as a result of climate change, of course. So through Kuwait Plant campaign, we raised the awareness on how plants play a key role on increasing oxygen level in the atmosphere and on capturing CO2 in the bark of the trees and the plants. We had been working with different partners. For example, the oil sector, all the oil companies, starting with Kuwait Oil Company in 2019 and the KNPC and so on and so forth. During COVID-19 lockdown, we did not stop our campaign. It continued, as we think that we believe also that it is the time we take action to to not only increase the awareness but also to save Kuwait climate and environment in Kuwait through the collaboration with all sectors of the society, whether it is public sector or private sector, civil society, and even individuals. All together we worked, and still until 2022 the campaign is ongoing successfully. With every year we have new partners joining us, making the circle of our partners increasing throughout the years.
What about the Habitat Program, the significant role in achieving Kuwait's sustainable development goals? Do you see anything in the horizon regarding this matter?
Well, since we opened our office in 2018 up until now, we had a successful partnership with our stakeholders in Kuwait, be it starting from Ministry of Foreign Affairs when we signed the agreement for the office, and then we have the Supreme Council for Development and Planning under the leadership of His Excellency General Secretary Dr. Khalid Mahdi. We've initiated with Kuwait, we helped in initiating Kuwait national reports that have been submitted to UN conferences and summits. And these reports are very important because they pinpoint success stories in Kuwait, and they contain data on how much progress Kuwait achieved in terms of realizing sustainable development. Also, these reports are very important to showcase how Kuwait, since 1952, since the first master plan of Kuwait was developed, Kuwait is one of the few countries in the world that has 100% infrastructure in urbanized areas.
So Kuwait was a pioneering situation,
in
always
many ways.
in the lead.
Exactly, yeah, in many ways, because during the corona lockdown, people lived easier lives than other nations around the world, because in each area in Kuwait they were under lockdown, and yet they have the amenities next to them. There are shopping malls in their areas, there are clinics, and also parks, and all the services in each area is provided. So during the lockdown they did not struggle as much as other countries, especially when it comes to, for example, having fresh water. The need for cleanliness and hygiene was very high because of the pandemic, and yet Kuwait was able to provide all the residents and dwellers with this very important element for combating COVID-19. So in terms of realizing sustainable development in Kuwait, our partnership with our stakeholders like municipalities and Supreme Council for Planning and Development comes in different ways. For example, we provide expertise where needed in terms of building strategies. We also ensure that Kuwait is contributing internationally in the summits and in the events that can showcase what Kuwait is doing, because it's very important to communicate with the outer world on what are we doing, what are our challenges, and what is our vision, especially Kuwait Vision 2035. It's one of the most ambitious visions in spite of the climate change, and yet Kuwait is doing its best to realize this strategic plan.
Dr. Al-Hassan, let's go back a little bit to COP27 summit. What about this, the UN Habitat Program initiative and the contribution? Do you see it is going to be the main focus of the whole thing or not?
Actually, COP27 comes in a very critical time in human history, because the world is now facing strange phenomena around the world.
Such as?
Increased floods in some parts of the world, increased precipitation and rain in other parts of the world, a shift of the seasons.
Or lack of rain.
In our side of the world, in the Gulf region, it is low precipitation rates, high rising temperatures.
What is the cause of that? Is it man-made or what?
Actually, for scientists, there are so many theories, but basically there is a proof that since the first industrial revolution in 1800, when man invented the machinery, this made life easier and knowledge
at the expense of the nature.
In many ways, yes. So with many factories around the world, there was for example, the ozone hole and all the emissions and the greenhouse gases.
Whatever happened to the ozone hole? They say they had a patch on it. Did they do that or not? They didn't do that.
It still exists, but in the north.
They're not talking about it anymore.
It exists, but scientists found that in the winter it shrinks and in the summer it increases. It exists on the north and south of Earth. And it causes skin cancer in some countries that have.
Your answer leads me to this following question. Do you have challenges to rectify the situation?
The whole world is facing a challenge, in fact, because in the last 200 years, there became a rise in the world temperature by only 1.5 degrees. But this caused a rise in the
awareness
in the seas of the world by high levels. For example, it is scientifically proven that the rise is many times since 1992. So this is very close by. Also, the phenomena that I mentioned, such as increase in snowfall in some parts of the countries and the monsoon rainfall in other countries is very
Did you read
high.
about the meltdown in the North Pole?
It can be related with the climate change.
This is very alarming, honestly, because it never happened before. This is because of the rising of the temperature.
Yes, because of the rising of the temperature in that part of the world, there is a chance for about 18 cities in the world to be underwater by 2050.
2050?
Yes, including Amsterdam, for example, New York, London, and even in the Gulf countries, the rise of sea level will be very catastrophic.
Catastrophic, yes.
Yes, exactly.
I hope I don't live to see that day.
No, it's our duty now to change our way of dealing with the environment. That's why it is called now in COP27.
Our style in life, it has to be utterly changed in order for us to survive for our generation and the following generation.
Yes, exactly. It is now a climate emergency. It is our duty now to plant more trees, to shift to alternative energy, safe energy and clean energy sources, try a little bit to stop using fossil fuels. But if we do use fossil fuels, then we have to plant more trees. We have to stop depleting earth resources. Also, the use of plastic is very horrible. The consumption rate of plastic became very high, especially in the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic. Because of COVID-19, people tendency to use plastic bottles and wear gloves, plastic gloves.
Fear of contamination.
Yes, so that resulted in more of generating solid waste that is the earth and the landfills cannot.
Since you mentioned the plastic, people say that in order for the plastic to dissolve in the land, it takes about 50 to 60 years. Is it correct theory or not?
It could reach 100 years.
100?
Yes.
So I'm being nice.
It depends. Now there is degradable plastic, and scientists recently found a new kind of bacteria that attack plastic and eat it, but it's still under investigation, and the studies are still very preliminary and very new to this kind of microorganisms that deplete the plastic. But for us now, it is our turn to lower down our consumption rate. Also, we should think of food security. So we should think of not only consuming as much as we need in terms of food, because our extra leftovers will end up in landfills, and it will impact the water table when they are when all the organic matter is buried underground. Usage of technology sometimes is bad because so much electronic waste is generated in the last few decades, especially when it comes to mobile phones, for example. Always there is a new version of mobile phones that is on the market every, say, 8 months. So consumption rate is very high. People are not thinking, even when it comes to, for example, clothes.
The materials.
There is so much clothes and material that is dumped without being used.
You mean recycling?
Recycling is a very important procedure and intervention that people can take, but also we have to think twice before buying any item in the supermarket. Everything, we should think about it in a different way. We have to think, what is the life cycle of anything we buy from the market? How it will end after we finish from it, or if we are bored. So
what are you saying? So we need to educate the public how to consume things and to consume it. Otherwise, we are going to be in a world of hurt in the near future.
We have to think that the earth is not, it's not like a house where you have walls separating the rooms, but the earth is a continuous thing. So, for example, in 1991, when oil fields were burning in Kuwait, in fact, they had acid rain in Himalayas.
In the Himalayas.
Because of the air traveling. And the same thing, the earth, the sand and the water and the air, they are
all
not
connected with each other, like all the oceans and the seas and the atmosphere here and there, all connected with one circle, correct?
Yeah, we have to be more wise. We don't lack education, by the way. In Kuwait, for example, one of the highest rates of education in the world, according to the UNESCO reports. But there is a difference between knowledge is something and awareness is another thing. So taking action starts from us individuals. And we have to think of ourselves as not being myself alone. I could be a daughter, a mother, a sister, and also employer, or maybe a minister, or I could be myself as an individual. I have many roles in my society, so I have to fulfill my role while putting in consideration what is the future for my future generation. If I take this action, if I start planting trees, if I lower my consumption, I don't want to deprive myself from anything, but I need to consume as much as I need, not more. And in fact, when sustainability came in as a term in the world in 1986, it was only environmental sustainability, but the world as progressed in implementing sustainability, economic sustainability and social sustainability were invented. So things are really interlocked, and the matrix of life is not something that can be like separated one from another. Everything is interlinked. So COP27 basically is saying that all nations of the world should take at a leader's level very tough decisions, that because we cannot go back to business as usual. That's not the case. Life is getting more complicated. Everyone should have a pledge to change.
Excuse me. You hold this thought because we have a report, and I'd love to go deeper about exactly what you're saying. Sharm el-Sheikh hosted the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, with the aim of building on a previous success and paving the way for future ambition to effectively tackle the global challenge of the climate change. More details with Sheikha Al-Aziz.
World leaders are set to discuss action to tackle climate change at the UN Climate Summit in Egypt. Egypt Summit COP27 is the 27th annual UN meeting on climate. It will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh from 6 to 18 of November. It follows a year of climate-related disaster and broken temperature records. UN Climate Summit are held every year for governments to agree steps to limit global temperature rises. They are referred to as COPs, which stand for Conference of the Parties. The parties are the attending countries that signed up to the original UN Climate Agreement in 1992. COP27 Summit aim at building on previous success and paving the way for future ambition to effectively tackle the global challenge of climate change. The conference represents an additional push to governments in the Middle East and North Africa to focus on climate action, as many efforts to address climate change in the region remain driven mostly by civil society actors and the private sector. And since temperatures are rising almost twice as fast in the Middle East when compared to the rest of the world, climate action must be a regional priority. Climate change is a conflict shaping the socio-economic grievances of vulnerable communities and undermining agriculture, economic growth, as well as the population's health and well-being. The implications of climate change are also heating by governance shortcoming, political dispute, and lack of transnational cooperation, which COP event attempt to overcome. In the Middle East and North Africa, disputes between Iran and Iraq have contributed to water shortage in Iraq, while the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project threatens Egypt and Sudan's water resources. COP27 is scheduled to take place amid large-scale geopolitical and economic shift with long-term implication for states, markets, and communities as a result of several crises, including post-pandemic economic ramifications, which were further triggered by Russian war on Ukraine and other global and regional challenges related to climate change and their wide-ranging implication on political security and economic development.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
Hello everyone, you're still with us right here on Ktv2. We were talking to Dr. Ameera Al-Hassan, UNHGCC Regional Office Head Mission in the state of Kuwait. Now we have a phone call all over to the Republic of Egypt. We have Hend ElSayed Hani, Foreign Affairs Editor, AlAhram newspaper in Egypt. Good evening, ma'am, and thank you so much for being with us.
Good evening.
It is a pleasure always to have you here, and we'd like to talk about the COP27 summit. The question, as Egypt hosts the COP27 with the aim of building on previous success and paving the way for future ambition to effectively tackle the global challenge of climate change. The question is, ma'am, what are the steps that are being taken by the nation to combat the global warming?
In fact, the main challenge now facing the parties of conference is to limit the average temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius degrees compared to the pre-industrial levels as agreed in Paris Accord. Current pledges admit will only limit global warming to about 2.4 Celsius degrees, which might pose a climate catastrophe. Countries need to agree on further cuts to emissions of carbon dioxide, which causes climate change, and also should seek to plans to cut the use of coal, which is responsible for 40% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. In COP26, countries only agreed a weaker commitment to phase down rather than phase out coal after late intervention by China and India. Leaders should do more to fulfill the pledge to stop deforestation by the year 2030 and also should work on the scheme to cut 30% of the methane emissions by 2030. Methane is responsible for the third of human-generated warming. The goal is to keep cutting emissions until they reach net zero by mid-century.
One final question. How will nations affected by the climate change be compensated by the rich countries?
Will be what?
Compensated.
Yes. Actually, there's a breakthrough that happened today that countries convening agreed on the payment to the loss and damage caused by climate change to developing countries, but not as a compensation, as a donation. There are demands for a separate stream of finance dealing with loss and damage. Effectively, compensation for the harm done by all the greenhouse gases emitted by the industrialized world over the past 200 years. But rich countries have already ruled out any language which suggests formal liability for damages which could run into trillions of dollars. Wealthier nations fear they would be forced to pay compensation for decades. Between the years 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 extra deaths per year. That's from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and the heat stress alone, according to the World Health Organization. In the year 2009, developed countries committed to give $100 billion a year by the year 2020, but the target was missed and moved back to 2030. So Sharm el-Sheikh Summit is hoping to press countries to pay for to pay as the $100 billion pledged. Developing countries want to see at least $1 trillion a year by the year 2030. Developing countries as a minimum will want loss and damage finance to be on the agenda item, and it was agreed upon it already. The developing countries will also be pushing to have a date set for when they might start to receive payment.
Hend, ElSayed, thank you so much for being with us. That was a very informing information that you gave us. Ladies and gentlemen, still with us on Ktv2. It's time for a break for Miss Al-Hassan to be comfortable and have a coffee. We'll come back to you.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
The state of Kuwait is committed to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals SDGs on the national level, as it is a participating country in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development issued by the United Nations since 2015. Moreover, to seek through this agenda to achieve completely the 17th Goals of Sustainable Development with economic, social and environmental dimensions. Once again, we'd like to welcome Dr. Ameera Al-Hassan, UNHGCC Regional Office Head Mission in the State of Kuwait. Thank you so much for staying with us. You are listening with me as well as the audience, the viewers, talking to the phone call through Egypt, and she gave us a very alarming situation. But let's go back to our main subject, as the State of Kuwait is a pioneering in improving the quality of life, honestly, and affected the people around the world, natural disaster and wars, and also the elevation of poverty and the continuance of the humanitarian aid by the state of Kuwait. What about this situation? The delegation is attending the COP27 summit. Do you think that the same thing is going to continue as far as the Kuwait is concerned by giving the hand to the others? They are in need.
Actually, Kuwait forever started helping nations in need. Wherever there are disasters, a humanitarian need, you will find Kuwaitis helping. Whether it is a Red Crescent or if it's the International Islamic Charity Organization or Kuwait Fund. Those are simple examples or few examples, but there are many examples of Kuwait playing its role as a humanitarian center since a long time ago, and also during the COVID-19 when nations were struggling to get the vaccination for cleanliness and etc. etc. But still Kuwait played its role. While doing that, Kuwaiti government has focused on its vision, New Kuwait Vision 2035, and realizing sustainable development goals through the 7 pillars of New Kuwait 2035. I think Kuwait should continue on doing so. I commend the opening of the clean fuel refinery that took place earlier this year. And also Kuwait announced a mega project that entails cleaning and rehabilitating the topsoil that is contaminated by oil leakage in Ahmadi and south of Kuwait. So the rehabilitating of the topsoil in south of Kuwait is one of the major actions that can lead to revitalize and bring life back to the soil in the desert of Kuwait. I think Kuwait is very serious in terms of combating the effect of climate change. And yes, it's been suffering because of climate change in the last 4 decades, but because they rely on water desalination and getting fresh water for inhabitants of Kuwait and dwellers. But still the increase of diseases that are related to the environment as a result of climate change enforce the government to take more actions towards combating the effect of climate change on Kuwait. I think it's not an easy job. It's not the job of the government alone. We all should work together. From my side, as a UN Habitat head of office in Kuwait, we are ready to provide expertise in terms of alleviating and increasing the infrastructure of Kuwait. The infrastructure of Kuwaiti urban areas in Kuwait is very good in terms of having infrastructure that includes electricity, water, internet, all the services. But in light of COP27, we need also to shift to renewable energy sources. We need to shift to more innovative solutions towards achieving food security in Kuwait by introducing new agriculture and farming technologies in Kuwait in order to expand in this field in particular. Also, we need to look into increasing oxygen level in Kuwait. I'm sure the government takes in consideration all these, but as I mentioned earlier, it's not only the government work, it's the private sector also, civil societies, individuals. We all should work together to develop this matrix of combating the effect of climate change. I'm looking forward to see what Kuwaiti delegation, the high-level delegation in Sharm el-Sheikh COP27, what will they say? How will they tackle this issue and what pledges that Kuwait will put on the table there.
That takes me to my final question to you, Doctor. How do you describe the representative of His Highness, the Amir, the Crown Prince speech in this summit and addressing the climate change, the aspirations? Since you mentioned it, you have to answer this one here.
Actually, from my personal point of view, I think Kuwait is, His Highness is very conscious on what is needed in the coming future and what actions. So his speech is very conscious about what is the demands of Kuwait and what are the challenges and what is the future. What are we going to do in the future? I'm sure everything that has been said put in consideration the ambitions of Kuwaiti people and the Kuwaiti government while putting in consideration the effect of climate change, because Kuwait is part of the international community. So we cannot separate, nothing is independent. We all align and we all depend on each other. Therefore, I commend his speech.
We all are in this together. Doctor, please stick around because I have another phone call. But I would love to tell you this one here. In related issue, the Ocean Purpose Project, OPP, is a social enterprise driving ocean conservation and plastic pollution prevention via disruptive and creative projects with mass scale impact. OPP is an innovation solving the ocean plastic crisis through plastic to fuel, biological and behavior change. OPP unique selling point is to use an innovative technology to enter the market, such as plastic to fuel and bioplastics. And now, as I said earlier, we have a phone call with Dr. Dalal AlGhawas, Strategy and Business Development Ocean Purposes Project, to speak more about this experience. Good evening, ma'am, and thank you so much for being with us.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure all ours. Could you please tell us about the experience in the Ocean Purpose Project, your career, and what will be presented from your side in the summit?
Absolutely. And you gave a great introduction about what Ocean Purpose Project does. So my role in the company is, involved in the business development and strategy team. So we are working to effectively grow this company from a startup into sort of a seed stage, high growth company. And by doing this, we are involved in further, let's say, enhancing the commercialization of this project and to be able to engage multiple stakeholders to develop a proof of concept and then move in towards, let's say, sales and distribution. So Ocean Purpose Project actually started off as a social enterprise, which was, geared towards, solving ocean problems, from, let's say, ocean plastics to ocean remediation and many others. And they do this by engaging multiple stakeholders through sort of local communities as well as industry and governments. So the purpose of this, let's say, project and what we're doing at COP27 is being able to demonstrate how, companies and multiple stakeholders can be involved in developing sustainable future. So for, let's say, the plastics to fuel, let's say, segment that they're focusing on, it's really important to engage multiple stakeholders and to show them that it's possible and feasible to create, let's say, a change now. And they do this by enabling technologies, making them mobile, sustainable, and customized for the industry so that they can use it, straight away. So the main issue for, let's say, all industries, be it maritime or agriculture, is we need to have practical solutions that can work while they're operating. And while they're operating, of course, because they're so complex and involve multinational, let's say, operations and environments, you need to have, let's say, a partner that can really understand their needs and develop a technology that's suitable for them. So at let's say, the COP27 summit, we're actually going to be presenting at the Energy Day. And from this, we're going to be demonstrating how, we can move beyond, let's say, beach cleanups of sort of, collecting plastics. And from that, move into the recovery of clean energy to develop, let's say, fuels from plastics, and then from that sort of create and drive, let's say the connections between social entrepreneurship, deep tech technologies, as well as, partnerships. And all of this is important because we want to be able to engage multiple stakeholders from, the NGOs to, technology partners, government regulators, as well as industry, so that we can really push the technology mainstream and make a change today.
What about the innovation of the field of climate action support food security? What about that?
Absolutely. So with regards to climate change, there are many different, let's say, agendas for the COP27 summit, including, let's say, climate finance, as well as looking at renewable energy, net zero implications, and also looking at the sort of damage and destruction of the environment. So when we look at all industries, including, let's say, the food and agricultural sector, we can see that there are some practices that need to be, let's say, further enhanced or improved to reduce their climate impact. So I'll give you like two examples. The first example would be around, let's say, agriculture with, growing certain crop commodities such as rice that currently emits, let's say, very high methane emissions. So from this, we need to have technologies that can reduce that and be able to, create, let's say, carbon sequestration agricultural practices. The second example would be around, let's say, animal agriculture, let's say, livestock. We know that, let's say, ruminants, the larger animals such as cows, do also emit large amounts of methane. And, what can we do to mitigate that? There are multiple solutions. One solution could be, let's say, focusing on the animal feed to be able to reduce those emissions. And other technologies are a bit more, let's say, advanced, where we try to develop analogs to meat. So create an alternative protein that has less, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions, better feed-to-food ratios, and less, let's say, environmental destruction, so that we can, let's say, reduce our reliance on animal protein. So there are a lot of different, let's say, approaches that we can focus on. But overall, what I wanted to tie into and why, I'm involved with Ocean Purpose Project is when we look at, let's say, the food industry and we look at, let's say, food safety and food quality, most of our food is packaged and distributed through plastic. So with plastic, it is the best material to ensure the food safety because it is an inert material. Right now, we have many companies trying to work on plastic alternatives, but it's still going to be something that will be developed in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. So in the meantime, we still have to rely on plastic as food packaging, but we want to make sure that we are able to control, let's say, the plastic waste, and by finding, let's say, unique opportunities that can encourage multiple stakeholders to take action, to be involved in, let's say, the plastic waste collection in all environmental situations. And from this, that is why it's so important. The Ocean Purpose Project is giving incentives and giving purpose to industries to be able to collect that plastic and to really generate it into profit. And this is, from day one of their operations. So, I really see this as practical solutions. It's not about, let's say, pointing the finger at specific industries or specific practices, but how can we work together in a multi-stakeholder fashion to really come up with solutions and implement them effectively.
Dr. Dalal AlGhawas, thank you so much for being with us. That was Dr. Dalal AlGhawas, Strategy and Business Development of Ocean Purpose Project, to speak about exactly what Dr. Hassan she was talking about. We're going to take a break and come back with Dr. Al-Hassan.
Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, raising awareness and finding solutions, avoiding the worst impact of climate change. Global emissions need to be reduced. It's time for climate action. Pledges and commitments, clean energy and sustainable development to protect the globe.
A new report from the UN Climate Change was issued earlier on the 26th of October shows countries are bending the curve of global greenhouse gas emission downward by, and also underlined what those efforts remains insufficient to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. We have this report and come back with you.
A new report from UN Climate Change on 26 October shows that the countries are bending the curve of global greenhouse gas emissions downward, but underlines that these efforts remain insufficient to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The report also shows current commitments will increase emissions by 10.6% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. This is an improvement over last year's assessment, which found countries were on path to increase emissions by 13.7% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of UN Climate Change, declared the downward trend in emission expected by 2030 shows that nations have made some progress this year, adding that the world is still nowhere near the scale and pace of emission reduction required to put us on track towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. To keep this goal alive, national governments need to strengthen their climate actions plans now and implement them in the next 8 years. UN Climate Change analyzed the climate action plans known as nationally determined contributions of 193 parties to the Paris Agreement, including 24 updated or new NDCs submitted after the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow up until 23 September 2022. Taking together, the plans covered 94.9% of total global greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Current long-term strategies representing 62 parties to the Paris Agreement account for 83% of the world's GDP, 47% of global population in 2019, and around 69% of total energy consumption in 2019. This is a strong signal that the world is starting to aim for net zero emission. The report notes, however, that many net zero targets remain uncertain and postponed into the future. Critical action that needs to take place now. Ambitious climate action before 2030 is urgently needed to achieve the long-term goals of Paris Agreement. With the UN Climate Change Conference just around the corner, Steele called on governments to revisit their climate plans and make them stronger in order to close the gap between where emissions are heading and where science indicates they should be this decade. Moreover, Steele is urging national governments to come to COP27 to show how they put the Paris Agreement to work in their home countries through legislation, policies, and programs, as well as how they will cooperate and provide supports for implementation. He is also calling for nations to make progress at COP27 in 4 priority areas: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. Meanwhile, Samia Shukri, Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs and COP27 President-designate, said that COP27 will be the world's watershed moment on climate action. Moreover, raising ambition and urgent implementation is indispensable for addressing the climate crisis. This includes cutting and removing emissions faster and at a wider scope of economic sectors to protect the world from more severe adverse climate impacts and devastating loss and damage.
You're still with us right here on Ktv2. We're still talking about the climate change in the state of Kuwait and all around the world. Now is joining us Samia AlDuaij, environment specialist, and she is going to talk about the same thing we were talking about it since the beginning of this special program. Ma'am, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
What about the decisions and the schedule to be taken in the COP27 summit to tackle global warming? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the focus of this COP will be the implementation of the plans agreed in Glasgow last year. Countries last year submitted what's called their nationally determined contribution, which is each country deciding how they're going to reduce their emissions. And so this is for this conference, it will be the implementation of what was agreed last year. But this year, because the conference is in the developing world, and in particular it's in Africa, the developing countries are going to focus the discussion on adaptation and funding for adaptation. Because it's key that the developing countries are at the brunt of receiving the impact of climate change. However, they are not contributors in general. They haven't been historically, and even now their emissions are minuscule compared to the developed world. So one of the issues they will be discussing is funding for adaptation and technology transfer for the developing world, as well as this contentious issue which is loss and damage, meaning that the developing world is asking the developed world to compensate them for historic climate change and the damage that it's been causing because of historic use of fossil fuels.
Could you talk about the effective measures tackled by the climate change?
I mean, the most effective measure and the clear-cut, clear solution is mitigation. Mitigation meaning reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. And that means, using alternative sources of energy other than fossil fuels. And where we can't, we don't have a replacement for fossil fuels, then we try to sequester as much carbon from the atmosphere as possible, which is what the net zero target means, that you remove as much carbon from the atmosphere, but then for the carbon that you cannot remove, you have measures like nature-based solutions, which means using nature to absorb the carbon from the atmosphere. So this is really the most effective way. We need to get the carbon out of the atmosphere. And then obviously, because the climate change is already happening, the impact already being felt, adaptation is key, which means when you build in the future, you plan for climate risks. You build a more resilient infrastructure. You build a more resilient society to basically be able to adapt to the impacts that are already going to happen, because we are only aiming for 1.5 increase. We cannot stop climate change. What we can do is slow it down.
You mean contain the whole situation? You cannot change it, but you hope that you will contain it. That was Samia AlDuaij, environment specialist. Dr. Al-Hassan, you're still with us here. It's a pleasure always to have you here, and you have the opportunity to listen to our 2 phone calls. And they elaborated about the situation, and somehow they were agreeing about your point. Now, we were talking, she mentioned something about the resilience project. Now, we have the Kuwait Fund for the Arab Economic Development, adaptation of the resilience project for the cross-border and the dust zone between Kuwait and Iraq. We have witnessed this for the recent year. How can this project contribute in the climate action?
Yes, this project is a very unique project of its own because it's the first of its own in the Arab region. Meaning that using innovative interventions to combat the effect of climate change through rehabilitation of the hotspots of sand dust storms in southern Iraq, in an area called Al-Anbar in Iraq.
Al-Anbar.
Yes, and this area in particular generates sand dust storms that travel transboundary from the source area towards all the 6 Gulf countries, affecting the general health. It's affecting the economy of the countries, stopping shipping.
The aviation, don't forget the aviation.
Actually, for Kuwait, it cost $190 million loss on the Kuwaiti government as a result of sand dust storm events throughout the year. Therefore, this pioneering project will help by the end of the 4 years of intervention in the source areas to decrease the sand dust storm events by 35 to 40%. And we hope other nations will jump in to rehabilitate other hotspots that generate sand dust storms in phase 2 of this project. Kuwait Fund generously have funded the project by $14 million in order to collect data and monitor progress made, as well as collaborating with scientific institutes in order to measure how much the intervention is successful in the source area, as well as in the other countries that are receiving the sand dust storms. During COP27, the Kuwait Fund delegates will be attending in Sharm el-Sheikh, and UN Habitat will be holding a presentation with the Kuwait Fund as well, to showcase and to display the key theory of this project, because it is the first, as I mentioned, is the first of its kind. So we will share our experience since we signed this agreement on October 2021 until now, how much progress is made, what are the interventions that has taken place in the field, and other things that is related to Kuwait Fund, because basically Kuwait Fund, since it was initiated decades ago, they have been funding many projects around the world that are directly related to the sustainable development goals, to humanitarian actions, to finding new sources of clean energy, in other, for example, building dams for electricity, and using other sources, building infrastructure of countries. So we are very proud of this partnership between UN Habitat, Arab Region Office and the Gulf Office to implement in Iraq, but as a result Kuwait will be benefiting, and we are very proud to share this experience in COP27 along with other nations, and inshallah we'll do other projects also that we will announce in the future.
Honestly, that was a very educated and informative interview I have ever made in my entire life. Thank you so much, Doctor.
My pleasure. Thanks
always
for
a pleasure
having
to
me.
have you here.
Thanks.
You always add something really interesting in this matter. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Folks, that was the conclusion for our special program with our guest, Dr. Ameera Al-Hassan, UNHGCC Regional Office Head Mission in the state of Kuwait. This is Ahmed Al-Wasmi. Thank you so much for being with us. Don't forget, the entertainment will continue right after this. Bye-bye.